Hello, everyone. Welcome. So today we're excited to talk to you. We have what I think is quite an overlooked topic, looking at the failure rate of leadership hiring processes, why that is, what can be done about it. As way of introduction, my name's Alex. I am a managing partner at Savannah Group. I look after our talent intelligence consulting business and our talent analytics platform, MapX. I've been at Savannah for 8 years and have a background in executive search, marketing, technology, and consulting. I'm joined today by my esteemed colleague, James Davies-Love. James, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure thing. So I've been working in the search industry for over 10 years. My background is on the recruitment side, so specializing in the technology functional area, but over the last 4 years focused on talent intelligence and how to use data and insight to make better hiring decisions.
Thanks, James. I guess between us, we have quite an interesting perspective on leadership hiring and the recruitment landscape. Given our backgrounds, given the types of project work we do, we've worked with hundreds of clients on lots of different talent strategy scenarios, everything from location analysis to competitor analysis to understanding depth of talent for a particular hire they're looking to make. So I suppose we've really had an inside line into the thought processes that senior stakeholders in organizations have when they're thinking about leadership hiring, plus also working closely with HR and talent acquisition teams about how to actually kind of action that intelligence and put it into practice. Hopefully some of the things we share today are going to be helpful. The other side of that is that through our tech side of the business, MapX, James and I also spend a lot of time very deep into the data. So that platform has over 22 million people on it. We do a lot around data categorization, data structure, decision-making processes for algorithms and things like that. So I guess we've got the kind of like the practical consulting side of it and also the technical side of it as well. So those two experiences hopefully give us a fairly unique perspective that we can share with you. So getting into the topic for today, the headline title is "Why is 1 in 5 leadership hires still failing?" I think before we explore that further, we should unpack what do we mean by failing. So specifically what we're talking about for this is an external hiring process which is cancelled or doesn't successfully conclude. So we're not focusing on the success rate of individuals that have been brought into a business and whether they are exited early or don't last, I suppose, past a certain point of time. We're really looking at that hiring process and actually the cancellation rate of those hiring processes. So where do we get that data from? Well, there's a few different sources on this. One of those sources is the AESC, which is essentially a kind of committee that's associated with executive search firms. So they think that around 20 to 30% of executive search mandates are never completed. There's another data point, which is from the Executive Search Information Exchange, that thinks around 40% of executive searches fail. And there is anecdotal data from some of the ATS CRM platforms like Invenius, Bullhorn, Thrive, that report through their platform that completion rates are around 70 to 80%. So it seems to be fairly consistent that you're looking at a kind of 20 to 30% failure rates on external hiring processes. So I guess the first question to get us started is a failure rate of 20 to 30% acceptable? And what are the common reasons that leadership hiring processes end up being cancelled?
And it is a big question. And rather than dwell on whether or not it is acceptable or not, maybe it would be more sensible to have a think about the reasons why processes fail. And to do that, I think the best way to think about it is by looking at the recruitment process and thinking about the components of which mean that a process might kind of come off the rails at any period of time. So the levers you have to pull, there are a few of them. So the first is finding relevant people. So having a talent pool that you can approach, engage, introduce. The more people that you find, the more likely it is that you will have a long list and a short list that will be successful. So that's the first thing. The second thing is engagement rates. How can you engage that population? The better your engagement rate, the more people that you can speak to, the more people you can introduce, the more likely it is you'll be able to make a hire. You'll be able to, if there is a scenario where the talent pool is smaller, if your engagement rate is higher, the likelihood of a placement is still increased. And then there is the piece around process and what the gates are, what the hurdles are for hiring, how many stages, finding time in diaries, hiring by consensus, And then the last piece in the puzzle is compensation and getting the offer right. And at each of those gates, talent intelligence, to a greater or lesser extent, becomes important.
I do think whilst you kind of moved past the first part of the question around failure rate being acceptable or not, I think that there is like an inherent acceptance that hiring processes started and won't successfully conclude, which most companies, which most people just, as I say, kind of just accept. They don't really challenge that. That's why when I made the intro, I said I think it's kind of a bit of an overlooked topic. It just becomes almost like part of business operations or business as usual. I think it's fair to say also that there are some scenarios where something being cancelled is an outcome that you couldn't really mitigate against, right? So let's say that there was a significant restructuring that people weren't fully aware of that was taking place. But I mean, really, those should be the rare instances. I mean, I think perhaps sometimes businesses are a bit perhaps quick to set off on an external hiring process without fully considering what the impact might be of that individual being brought in, without, obviously, as we'll get onto later, fully understanding what the marketplace might look like for a hire they're looking to make. But as you ran through that kind of process breakdown, you can start to see there are so many gates, and it's like a funnel, isn't it? There's so many gates, there's so many steps. As you go through them, essentially the number of viable individuals, if you like, gets reduced further and further and further. I think that also comes back to another kind of human condition point, which is that everyone, whenever they're writing a brief, whenever they're looking at who they're going to hire, they naturally assume that there is going to be a whole line of individuals that are out there that have all the requirements that they're looking for and basically a perfect fit. I think there's some interesting psychology aspects around that, around things like confirmation bias, around things that are reflections from their own personal career, experiences they have in their team. So yeah, I mean, I think that, again, interested in your kind of views if you've got any comments on that, but I think there are certain situations where it not resulting in an external hire is a fair enough conclusion. But I think some of this also comes back to the kind of mindset, I suppose, of individuals as they're setting off on that process.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. And if we want to double click on that and think about setting off on a search process where you're not really sure what you're going to find, it makes sense to think about what the things that you probably need to think about before setting off on a search to ensure that you find enough relevant people. So are you thinking broadly enough in the sectors you're looking in? Is your role a standard role? Does it have a standard skill set and remit? Is it niche? Are you combining two different functional areas or specialisms that historically haven't been partnered together? Is it an emerging capability that only some businesses are doing? Does the talent pool have a lack of coverage on traditional platforms? Is the brief particularly complex? And by the time you layer on all of the capabilities together, are you left with very few people? So all of these things, we think, should be considered before embarking on a search. And if that information was available to start with, you might want to reflect on some of these and determine, is this really the way that we want to progress, or should we open up our thought process now before getting to a later stage where the decisions are already made and everything's locked in and there's no way you can U-turn? So that's, I think, an interesting kind of part of the conversation.
I think there's a bit there as well that you start to touch on, which is around stakeholder alignment. How many times in a process, as you get into further stages and other individuals are invited in to be part of interview panels, etc., their like expectations and understanding of what the role is there to do, but also what the specifics are of the role profile and what they're looking for aren't fully fleshed out. Where we also see, I think sometimes as well, there is an interest or an appetite in businesses initially deciding that they want to consider things that are very new or very different. And then without enough stakeholder kind of management, I guess, through that process, as they get further on, they then decide, actually, you know what, we are going to need someone that's kind of closer to home, particularly things from like an industry background perspective. And that can often be a derailer as well. The other point that comes to mind as well, I think is worth touching on before we move further down this kind of conversation, is the point in which a hiring team is engaged. I mean, how many times are we working with businesses or organizations where, to use the language you said, the brief is already set in stone by the time that it's being circulated, whether it's an internal team, an in-house team, or whether it's an external provider. they are getting a chance to have a look at it and understand it further. This is partly to do with the decision-making process of businesses, how things get signed off, but it's also it's very challenging, I suppose, at that point to try and influence back up, because the expectations have already been set that the specific blend of experiences, of skills, etc., the framing of what you're going to be hiring for is already clear, understood. It's been kind of approved. And it's almost like job done. Then off it goes to another team, and it's their job to go and execute. But sometimes, essentially what we're saying is those teams are being set up for failure, right? Because of a variety of factors, the bits that you touched on.
Yeah, it's a good point. And if we think about a scenario whereby a brief is defined and a search process is initiated, the market is comprehensively mapped. Say we find 50, 100 people that meet the brief, and that is the full candidate universe. That's everyone possibly in the market that has all of the key criteria that we're looking for. You approach those candidates, you have a short list, you have a long list, you have a short list. There is an ideal candidate. That candidate doesn't end up getting the role. What do you do then? Well, you're left with three options. You approach the same candidates again, and maybe it's been a few months later and some of those people re-engage with you. You revisit some of the people that said no first time round, and that's it, because there are only 50 or 100 people. The only other option is redefining the brief. And as you say, if the brief is set in stone, then that's very challenging to do. And what kind of compounds it at that stage, and this is why lots of searches do fall over, there has already been a short list and a long list found, and maybe there is an individual that the client love and for whatever reason hasn't managed to get the role. And I think there is something that we can refer to as candidate fixation, or like front runner bias, where the client gets so kind of wedded to a particular individual, there is little understanding that that person's skill set might be unique. And even in searches where at the early stages there are multiple people that everyone believes that can do the role, that fixation means that in competitive markets where approaching people are difficult and it's a limited skill set, it becomes difficult if you have to restart a process. And something to consider as well.
It's a problem in many factors. You've got wasted time and resources. You've got frustration among hiring teams and stakeholders. You've got the opportunity costs from prolonged vacancies. And fundamentally, you have some form of kind of reputational impact, let's say, whether it's, as I say, an external third party that's doing the hiring for you, or it's an in-house team. It makes me think of a kind of an extreme example, I suppose, which was an organization that was hiring for a general manager for one of its brands. It was a kind of consumer goods business. And the organization was super specific about the requirements for this role. It had to be based in a certain location, and they needed a kind of particular, fairly niche industry experience. That role stayed vacant for 2 years. They had 2 search firms working on it. They had an in-house team working on it. And the reality was, no matter how many different ways you looked at it, there just wasn't that skill set in that location for that business. It was interesting to me. I saw the other day, actually, I saw a report, and that brand in particular has started losing market share. And it's, as I say, now it's going on 2 years without having a kind of defined leader in that role. So, the impacts of this are pretty significant, really. So yeah, a more of an extreme example, but it just goes to show that once, again, it's like a human psychology thing, I think. Once things get locked in, and once people believe that there is a certain view, a certain perspective, they want a certain profile, essentially they're looking for, either because of people they met in the process or because of the requirements they're putting in, there is a tendency sometimes to double down on that and be quite resistant to it. Maybe it's how they feel that it's going to be perceived internally. Maybe it's another reason why they're unwilling to be more flexible about it. But I think the key point we're saying here is that once you reach that point that it is kind of set in stone, to keep using that language, your opportunity to influence and help introduce alternative perspectives to how they could approach that or solve that issue is challenged, right? So I guess in terms of moving this forward, then clearly we need to be earlier on in the conversation when we're trying to influence, so that we're not doing it when the brief is set in stone. Yeah, let's look at let's explore, I guess, some of the ways that businesses are doing that at the moment.
So okay, so really we do have a question from the chat. Yeah. I wonder if you'd be able to answer this, Alex. When should you give up on a search? You mentioned 2 years vacancy. What's the right moment to give up?
That is a good question, isn't it?
I do have an answer. Maybe it's not necessarily answering the question, but something you do see in some of these processes that go on a long time, and where coming up with the second longlist and shortlist is challenging. That there is a familiarity bias with internal incumbents, people that are at the business that initially weren't seen as being at the right level, or for various reasons at that point in time weren't considered succession candidates. Actually, when they compare them to external people, the importance of understanding the business or the sector or the specifics, understanding the stakeholder landscape, all of these things do sometimes make that internal person look favorably comparable to the external market. So in lots of these examples, you do see internal successors after a unsuccessful search process be successful successors in these roles.
But you're right. That's probably normally the natural conclusion, isn't it? But isn't that the kind of worst way to arrive at that ultimate conclusion decision? After a huge amount of time's passed, a load of money's been spent, a load of time's been spent, to go, well, actually, you know what? The rarity of what we're looking for means that internally, perhaps what we should do is look to promote individuals into that role, support them more from a learning development point of view. It feels like that could definitely be established far, far in advance. I think the other thing I'd say on that as well is that in some ways this perhaps is a reflection on an ability to influence strategic thinking at a senior level as well. And to me, that comes back to the relationship between talent in the business, between HR in the business, the role of the HRO or the HRD in that type of scenario as well. And really trying to make talent decisions as much as possible like a two-way dialogue with the business, rather than a order setting and order execution around bringing people into the organization. I think businesses, more should be done to influence senior leaders so that they are more open to discussion about what opportunities there are and what options they have. And also, I think as part of this, as we'll probably get to next, there are some ways that we've seen that you can influence that thinking well, beyond just continually trying to find people that look like they could be a good fit for a role.
Okay, well that segues quite nicely into the role of talent intelligence, doesn't it? So do you want to start and give us an overview of what talent intelligence is from your perspective?
So I think let's start with the definition of it as we think about it, because it can take a few different forms. In some organizations, let's start with what do we not think talent intelligence is from our perspective. So in some organizations, particularly very large businesses that have a close competitor set, talent intelligence can sometimes essentially be a synonym for competitor intelligence, where you'll have a team of recruiters who are continually in conversation with individuals at other businesses, trying to get any kind of intel and understanding about how happy people are, if there's rumors of a restructuring, certain areas of the business that perhaps there could be opportunity to acquire people from. So we don't really mean that kind of like battle carding type approach that you have with a small subset of businesses. We're thinking about the broader picture of talent intelligence, which is fundamentally the strategic use of data to inform leadership hiring decisions. So in our world, what that means is things like market mapping. So thinking about an upcoming hiring need, what could that market look like? What are the dynamics of the market? How common or rare are certain skills, experiences, backgrounds? What does diversity look like in the market? How distributed is that market? How often do they move roles? How easy would it be to engage them? So I guess the input signals, going back to your comments earlier from a process point of view, the input signals you look for to essentially understand, given what you're looking for, how viable is it going to be to execute that when it comes to a hiring process? There are also other broader kind of applications of talent intelligence as well. Things like competitor analysis, things like succession benchmarking. Fundamentally, we're looking at the importance of the brief and making sure that brief is as future focused as possible. So challenging the brief and making sure that the requirements of it are focused on what are the essentials for that role going forwards, and not just a rehash of what is currently there, alongside providing that kind of that data lens and that view on the market, which can be helpful when you're deciding essentially what bits of a brief you're going to lock in. So that's probably how we would describe talent intelligence and how we'd think about it. I think it's probably worth touching on as well, actually, the journey of this as a function, journey of it as a capability. It's a relatively new capability. Perhaps, James, you want to share a little bit about what has been happening over the past 5 or so years within our space and why talent intelligence has started to come to the fore much more. Okay.
But just to answer your question before we do that, what has changed over the last few years, and maybe why has talent intelligence and using data and insight to inform decision making become more relevant than it was historically? And I think that this is a change generally in our kind of culture and society to think about data first. Maybe it comes from the Michael Gove quote, "Don't believe in experts," or whatever he said, or maybe in the US, "Facts don't care about your feelings." If you have the data available, you don't necessarily need to just believe what people are telling you if they don't have data to hand. So if you can see the information and insight, and I think there is a move towards being to have visibility of this information rather than just people telling you and you believing them. So I think that there is generally a move towards wanting to see data and information to make decisions rather than believing people that are basing those opinions on their kind of expert understanding. And I think that's across the board. And I think some of that has impacted the kind of talent intelligence space more generally. But I also think in our area, where new positions, new capabilities are being created all the time, being able to hire people in roles and these roles didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago, require data, insight, and information in order for you to do so. People don't have expert knowledge and understanding of these new capabilities, and therefore leveraging data is the best way to do it. And I think that's more accepted than it was a few years ago too.
Yeah. I think the simplest way to package it is taking the guesswork out of recruitment. But yeah, I mean, as you say, I'd echo your thoughts. I mean, there's been the last 5 years in particular seen a huge increase in data availability. I think we're now approaching what I'd call the needle in the haystack problem. I mean, LinkedIn has over 1 billion profiles on it. There's other platforms that also, other social networks, etc., professional networking sites that have profiles too. That's a lot of information to sift through. There's a huge variety of variables once you start thinking about types of industries people work in, company sizes they've worked for, the functional experiences they've had, their seniority levels, etc. So it's a very large and very complex data set. And actually the problem now becomes more around, well, how do you weave through that as quickly as possible to find the blend of individuals? Because the other side of this is there's never going to be, I was thinking about this before we came on, I've not seen so far in all my time an identical profile for one person to another. No one's had exactly the same career journey, right? It's just not happened. So you can't therefore just find direct replicas of things. You're always looking for kind of transferability or inference, I suppose, around the certain things you're looking for and where that might come from. Huge amount of data, but through the use of algorithms, where we've done a lot with AI as well, basically how you can process that information very, very quickly, how you can categorize that information in ways that's much more helpful to recruitment teams when you're trying to understand and analyze that data set. And as you say, that shift to becoming more data literate as an organization. I mean, we've seen it in, my background is in marketing, and when marketing went more digital, that was like a massive shift that happened in that organization. You've got the same thing with sales, you've got the same thing with finance. I mean, HR has been on this journey through HRIS systems and things like that. But the world of recruitment particularly has been one of the last fields, I think, to have that kind of data overlay applied to it because of those complexities that we were talking about.
Mm-hmm. And it's a good point.
To me, though, we're standing. I think it's a really exciting time, really, to be part of this, because it's actually the things that used to take weeks to do and required specialist research teams with the time, capacity, know-how, industry expertise, etc., to be able to come back and say, okay, we've looked in the market, we found these people, we've categorized the information in a way that we can explain it to you. This is what we think that the dynamics of the talent market look like. That has now been reduced from essentially weeks to days, and in some cases hours. So I sometimes use the analogy of internet and broadband, and really what we've been running with so far up to this point is it's almost like dial-up, right? You start your internet connection, and it takes a long while for you to get a response, and the latency in that is very high. What we're moving to now is broadband, and then it'll go to fiber, So once you have much more immediacy of information, it means you can think about how you consider external recruitment hiring processes in a different way, right? You can stress test different scenarios or play out different options much more easily. You can then take those as a set of scenarios and use those to discuss with the organization. So I think the nature in which, and the opportunity in particular for talent acquisition and talent to shift to being much more strategic in terms of their engagement with the organization, much more consultative about how they work together to understand what the right fit might be externally and also what that could look like internally. It's a really exciting time to kind of be involved in this space.
You referenced there the complexity of talent data and data on people. And I think it's an important thing to think about in a little bit more depth, because yes, it is complicated, and yes, the availability of data and the ability to understand that data has progressed hugely over the last few years. But I think we're still at a stage whereby there are unanswered and unanswerable questions. And what we are saying is that we can better and quicker understand 80% of the reality, but the final 20% of understanding is something that still needs to be done and attained through traditional methodologies. But, things like exact reporting lines and the way that naming conventions of seniorities differ in different organizations and regions and markets and divisions, and all of this stuff is complex, and it is ever changing as businesses restructure, and people don't necessarily, which is our favorite scenario, represent themselves in the most accurate way in terms of describing their remit and responsibilities, their job titles. So the manual validation or the traditional research validation is always going to be part of the talent intelligence process, and at least part of the talent intelligence process at leadership level, and understanding truly how organizations fit together and the roles that individuals play within a team needs to take place, yes, with the basis of automated research and building talent pools and understanding how they fit together. And that can be sped up and facilitated by some of the tech. But speaking to people, understanding how people interact with each other, we still need to do by speaking to people effectively.
Yeah, and that segues neatly into a couple of questions we're being asked, actually, which is essentially around how you are doing this in combination with looking at the internal picture at the organization, and also around kind of more of the behavioral analysis of individuals, of leaders. I think you kind of touched on that, but just to kind of reframe it in a slightly different way. So when we think about that lens, as an external party, we're always reliant on the organization giving us a steer, providing us with that information. The things that we would typically look for are across a successor map. What does the successor depth look like across key positions? So typically, you're looking at critical hires, you're looking at the senior leadership team, you're looking at they're ready now, they're ready 2 year, they're ready 4 year, however the organization structures it. And you're looking to identify areas which is perhaps a bit thin in terms of coverage, but also where they do have successors that are being put forward in place. You're also looking at their profiles too and considering, okay, well, how similar is that to the current person that's in role? And then crucially with this, we talked about it earlier, we've got to change our thinking to go, okay, well, that's great in terms of what this role looks like now, but what's this role going to look like in 2 to 3 years, right? And what are the requirements of that? So classically, when we work with organizations on this, they'll have some kind of view that flows from the business strategy around what their key roles are across the organization, but also crucially, strategically, I suppose, where they think they're going to be providing or having more emphasis going forwards. So the first thing we'll then look to do is go, okay, well, let's understand that a lot. Let's understand which areas of business are strategically important and what the requirements are going to be for those leaders in those roles. Once we get that in place, we can then start to use that to then go, okay, well, how does that compare to what you've got currently? How does that compare to successors? And go on from there. The other bit about behavioral, I think, is you've neatly summarized it there. The problem statement that we're looking at is you could think of it as technical in nature. When a requirement is produced, when a brief is produced, you're going to have a combination of like hard skills, if you like, things that can be determined based on the types of roles people have had, the types of companies they've worked at, the types of organizations they've worked in. And then you're also going to have softer skills, right? What their style is, how they behave, how they act. That second category, I mean, there's already been a huge amount of kind of focus and interest in that. You've got a whole raft of psychometric assessments, and there's lots of different things you can do from an interview point of view, competency-based interviewing, etc., to try to understand that. For us, we're mainly concerned with that first bit, that technical piece, right? Essentially, who are we thinking about getting in the room? Think of it that way. And then from that point onwards, it's then about, and of those people getting in the room, who seems to be the best fit, I guess, for the kind of style and behaviors that we want within that lead that we're looking to put into the role. So yeah, so for us, the behavioral bit really sits on the end piece. Sometimes you can infer it a little bit, can't you, based on the organizational environment. We know certain businesses act in certain ways. Some businesses have a reputation for how they're run, what the culture might be like. So you can kind of infer it, and it gives you a sense. But it's not something you can really test until you're in that kind of one-to-one conversation.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, to the point we were talking about right at the top, how does this track back to a recruitment process? And the bits have the bits where talent intelligence has the kind of highest degree of importance are the piece which is around finding relevant people. How many people do we think we're going to be able to find? And some of the TI data points are around what the likely engagement for that population is. How frequently do they move? How open are they to approaches? How many other organizations are hiring for similar roles? What are the historic engagement rates for that population? So who are we going to go after, and what is the likelihood that they're going to speak to us, and what is the likelihood that they're going to be interested about a particular opportunity? Gives you a good idea of the number of people that you'll be able to work with to do the kind of behavioral assessment slightly further on down the process.
Yeah. And I suppose to kind of like summarize this section, so what we're saying is the starting point for this is a slightly broader conversation about requirements for a role. Sometimes it's already written out as a kind of brief, but it's more a briefing that you might have to almost verbally, I suppose, with a hiring manager or with a client for them to describe what they're looking for, overlaid with an understanding of what the successor picture looks like in that organization and also their profile too. Then what you're looking to do is go, okay, well, hold that thought. Let's go away and just gather some, based off what you've described, let's go and start having a look at what that talent landscape looks like. Let's then reconvene, and depending on the kind of like the depth of information an organization requires, it could be in 48 hours, it could be in a week, it could be in 2 weeks, depends on the particular scenario and what exactly they want to look at. Let's then come back and have a conversation about that, and we can share with you what we're starting to see about that market, what some of the key decision parts might be in terms of specific skills, experiences you're looking for, or particular points that you're looking for, and how that might impact ultimately the viability of selecting those options. And from that, we can then almost basically partner to then create with the brief and then accelerate into the external hiring piece. I suppose the other bit that is advantageous to this as well is that by doing this, we can start to calibrate on actual profiles in the market as well. I think this is a really important thing too, right? So how often is there a difference between what is described on a sheet of paper and the actual like acceptance or like match fit of profiles that individuals see as they get back from market? I mean, you can often unearth that actually things that they said that were very important from a written brief perspective are more of a kind of secondary consideration once you actually start to show profiles too. So I think it's worth mentioning that too. This isn't just in our experience anyway, the best way to do this isn't a just flat data insights exercise, because it's useful, but it's not very tangible, right? I mean, fundamentally it's a people thing, isn't it? You're starting to then, if you start to show profiles, you're thinking a bit more about what would it mean to have this person in the organization? How do I think that would fit with my expectations? And so that, I mean, we call it calibration, don't we? That's a super important step that we'd combine with it. So as I say, we're really advocating an approach where you go, here's the data from the market, and here are some examples of different profiles that have different mixes, different ingredients, I suppose, around what you're looking for. And then from that, we can have a wider conversation about exactly who's in the bullseye. We can talk about the viability of that and plan the brief from there.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, because there are in people's profiles, when you look at a person, and their career history and the companies they've worked for, there are intangibles there. There is an emotional reaction when you see an organization. Mm-hmm. Is that the kind of business that we want to hire from? Are they doing great things? And that, like, are they doing great things, comes from lots of different sources and previous experience. And it's really hard to understand that in information. And therefore, calibration is super important. But calibration is something that, of course, happens in traditional recruitment processes. and search processes without the requirement for talent intelligence. But what you don't have sometimes where you do that in a kind of traditional format of a process is, well, this individual is that an anomalous piece of experience? How many other people like that are there? Can we base our whole search strategy on someone that looks perfect? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But understanding that the data behind that fork in the road, I think, is really important. And I think it maybe takes us on to the kind of next point, which is integrating information, data, calibration into a process without slowing it down. Did you have any particular thoughts on this part, Alex?
Yeah, I suppose that is sometimes a pushback to this, right? Well, surely if you're doing this stuff, it sounds like more work up front, and it is more work up front. Well, isn't that overall going to therefore delay the hiring timeline? Doesn't that mean that we actually are slower to get to the right answer? It's a fair challenge, but I think you need to kind of unpack that a little bit more to really understand what the payoffs and the trade-offs are. So look, I mean, it kind of goes back to the stat a little bit as well, right? So if we're saying 1 in 5 leadership hires fail, well, that means 4 in 5 are successful, right? So there are, of course, scenarios where what you're describing, what you're looking for from a brief perspective, as that translates into the market, is actually very viable, and you can hire those people in relatively easily. I think some of the comments you made earlier referenced that, particularly where it is a like for like or a well understood position in an organization where the role is fairly typical, or it's been hired for before or recently or something like that, the viability of executing that, you can be more confident essentially that the market is going to be able to provide what you're looking for. However, as you start to go into those newer type roles or dual remit type roles, or a role in a different location, or a role with a different structure, or a role in a different part of the business, the question marks start kind of popping up and occurring. I think some of this is, and so therefore, sorry, just to finish that, therefore that's where this kind of 1 in 5 starts occurring. The thing I think about it is the kind of the asymmetry between this, because hiring expectations essentially whenever a brief is produced is like 100%, as in like it is going to be successfully executed every single time is the expectation. Anything that deviates from that expectation is seen as a negative thing. And I think whether you're on our side of it as a kind of an external third party, or whether you're working internally at an organization, it's your reputational management that you're really dealing with. How do you want to be viewed in the organization going forwards? And really what you want to be viewed as is a strategic partner to the business, which is helping them acquire the right leadership capabilities to drive their business strategy forwards, not just a kind of an operational order taker. So some of this to me is kind of going slow to go fast. When you start to, over one hire, maybe it doesn't save you that much time. But as you use this process over more and more hires and use it more consistently, you get those payoffs because you're essentially ensuring that you don't waste time on the, trying to find the unicorns essentially that don't exist and slow the whole process down. I think, again, from a stakeholder point of view, it's one of those where it's not a problem until it suddenly is a problem. And so, again, I think the onus is on you to try to mitigate that and to manage that relationship, manage that expectation, ensure that your brand, whether you are, as I say, an external provider or an in-house team, is going to be viewed positively by others in the organization. So yeah, I think to me, those are the two areas that make this definitely a worthwhile thing to do. The overall time benefits when you multiply it over numerous assignments, and that stakeholder management expectation client relationship.
I think there's another point here as well, and it harks back to some of the points we were making earlier about changes in this kind of field over the last few years. And when it comes to individual contributor or more junior hiring, data on those populations, because they are more standard talent pools and because the complexity of requirements is often less, it's quite easy to build representative populations of individuals from which to make assessments off. And there are various tools that help you do that in a kind of relatively straightforward way. It does become more challenging at leadership levels, and especially in leadership roles where the brief is very specific. And historically, building representative talent pools is challenging. And to build a representative talent pool, essentially, you need to do an executive search process or the research of an executive search process in order to do that. However, over the last few years, being able to build super specific leadership talent pools quickly and sometimes in an automated way means that you have that information sooner and you can integrate that data sooner in the process. There's kind of one caveat to that here, which is, do organizations feel comfortable in using representative data to inform decisions? And I guess the second thing is, do, as you were talking about earlier with the kind of internal culture of businesses, do organizations feel comfortable to change their thinking about a position based on that information? And you need both of those things to take place.
100%. I mean, this has been clear to me definitely through our work on the technology side. You can build very powerful technology systems, things that measurably improve parts of a process. However, if there isn't the internal understanding and willingness to change and adjust operational models for how things are executed, how value is added, for how information is presented, how it's shared, how it's talked about, how it's discussed, etc., then this approach doesn't land. So it's both to execute this well, you both need the side of it, which is the confidence, I suppose, in data gathering and analysis, the understanding to be able to talk through profiles that are relevant, and the ability to really kind of tell a story, to be able to consult with an organization and to guide their thinking on it. And that requires behavioral changes fundamentally, rather than just a step change in terms of gathering information and injecting it into a part of the process.
Yeah, we've almost come up to time, and we said we would leave ourselves a little bit more time to look at the questions.
We had a question which was about data sources, data scraping. We've obviously talked about LinkedIn. The question is, well, what other websites, what other sources are there essentially that you can use for data scraping? Do you want to give this one a go? It's probably more my world, isn't it, than yours, but I think you've got a perspective on it too.
So, I mean, there are lots of different sources that one can use. LinkedIn, of course, has the largest quantity of publicly accessible profile information, more than 1 billion profiles on LinkedIn. So there's no better source for people data. However, there is people data in other places, on company websites, available through Google and accessible via Google Deep Search. So there is other sources of people information that you can use. And if you do want to do things comprehensively, then you would look at all of those sources.
Yeah. It's a good answer. I think to summarize my thoughts on that, those two things you mentioned, our particular area of specialism is around leadership hiring, so that's what we're mainly focused on. We're not, if you are hiring, I don't know, technology engineers or something like that, there's other, GitHub, Quora, there's kind of like niche communities that you might be looking to access. From our perspective, what we're looking for is high levels of coverage, but also high levels of consistency in terms of how data is structured, so that we can make it easier to make direct comparisons between it. So, others aren't as kind of open about it, I guess, but LinkedIn data and LinkedIn profiles is a fundamentally the backbone of all those types of efforts. I think from a leadership point of view, as James touches on, the gap really exists around certainly very senior leaders and big public companies. They might not have a LinkedIn profile. And so therefore, or even if they do have a LinkedIn profile, understanding at some organizations what the senior leadership team or executive committee actually looks like versus other individuals that might have kind of similarly titled or similarly named roles can be quite difficult as well. So company websites for us is definitely a reliable source that we use to kind of build out that picture further. But in some ways, I kind of go back to the comment I made earlier, which is that it's less now, to be honest, about how many different data sources can we get. That was really the thinking from, to me, kind of 5 to 10 probably years ago, when you had smaller pockets, you had some niche social networks in certain countries, and you're trying to kind of stitch that together. That's still a viable thing to do. I think more now it's about how is all this information labeled, how is it categorized, how are you able to quickly interrogate it to find what you're looking for. Because there's always, I mean, as we know, particularly when you're looking at it from a leadership point of view, your gap analysis is fairly obvious, right? If you are looking across a range of organizations and you're looking for, I don't know, the individual that's leading the technology part of that business, and you're not clearly finding a CIO or a CTO or CDO or something similar, you can probably make the assertion that they will have someone in that capability, and you need to look a bit deeper into it. So you can kind of top it up on an individual basis rather than need to do it on a mass basis. I think with that, we should probably draw the session to a close. So look, thank you everyone for joining. I really appreciate you taking the time today, and thank you for the questions. If anyone else has any more questions that they would like James or I to answer, please do send them through afterwards. If you are looking for anything that's around talent intelligence, any other executive search services, interim, etc., please visit our website at savannahgroup.com. If you're interested in our product technology, you can find out more about that on mapex-a. Thank you again for joining us.